another production of Stories Near and Far. My name is Dave Noble, and I'm happy to present a special storyteller this time. He grew up in Montana on a farm, passed the bar exam after graduating from college, and then was hired by the FBI to be a covert agent. I present to you Bob Dellwo.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's kind of a thing for me to be reliving a case that I'm going to tell you about. I'm going to tell you about a case I used to call the threshing machine case that originated when I was a young agent in the Denver Field Division back when I was 24 years old, over 56 years ago. And I was working in the Denver Field Office in what we call the SINRAD case, capital S-I-N-R-A-D, all capitalized, which stood for Soviet Infiltration of the Radiation Lab at Los Alamos near Albuquerque. Kind of strange that at that time, in 1944, even though Russia was our main ally in the war against Germany, that we were also spending much of our investigative time of Russian espionage. And in this case, there threatened espionage at Los Alamos in the invention and the production of what eventually became the atomic bomb. I might tell you how this case began. I was traveling back and forth, and I received a telephone call from the agent in charge at Oklahoma City. And he said, "Hey, Bob, we hear you're from the Flathead Indian Reservation, and that they refer to you as the farm boy from Montana." He said, "What do you know about threshing?" I said, "I know everything about threshing." I said, "My father and grandfather used to operate one of the largest threshing machine businesses in the state of Montana. What can you do in a threshing operation?" I said, "I can do everything, just like any other farm boy that has lived in such an environment could do." But he said, "We have this case on the panhandle of Oklahoma of this large threshing operation in which we are practically sure that the operation is skimming the wheat on this reservation." Skimming means stealing wheat. In other words, it's practically assumed that in any threshing operation, the operator is skimming wheat, and there are many ways to skim wheat. And in this case, of course, they were alleged to be skimming what we call Indian wheat, which would be a violation of federal law. And he says, "Do you think you can handle it?" I said, "Well, who else do you have that knows anything about threshing?" Well, let's leap forward with the story. In a matter of a couple of days, I was walking down the road, dressed as an itinerant farmer or farm boy, even with a bed pack, and I was walking by where this threshing outfit was in operation. I looked in and I was astonished. It looked like back home on the operation that my father had had. I walked in the lane toward it a couple of hundred yards and stopped and listened. And I have to tell you that I was surprised. Here was a threshing machine, a 15-wagon threshing machine, which I'll describe later, almost identical to the one that my family had operated in the Flathead in Montana and on which I had worked as a young man on and off for a number of years. A man approached me and he said, "Well, who are you?" I said, "Well, I'm an itinerant farm laborer. I'm heading for Washington. I hope to get there someday." He said, I said I was passing by and I needed a little money, and I never saw a threshing operation that didn't need another man, and I thought I'd come in and maybe get a job for a few days. He said, "What can you do?" I said, "I can do anything. There's nothing about your threshing operation that I can't do." He said, "Can you sew sacks?" I said, "I can sew sacks." He said, "Well, the Indian chief that's supposed to be the sack sewer, he didn't show up this morning, and I've been pinch hitting. It's really put a crimp on us. Come on up here and let me see you sew a sack or two." I went up, and there were 3 spouts coming down out of this typical threshing machine, filling sacks that had to be sewed. I grabbed one and jiggled it, grabbed the needle and the string, did the loop-loop over the left ear, and did the loop-loop over the right ear, and he said, "You can sew sacks." He said, "Can you stay for a few days until the chief gets back?" And I said, "I can." He said, "Can you haunch the sack onto the truck. Now that's a technical word, haunching. Haunching means that if you know what you're doing, you do not pick up the sack like this. You roll it over your knee, you roll it up to your shoulder, and you haunch it onto the truck. And that's what I did. He said, well, I can see you've done that before. So for the next 3 days, I was their sack sewer, and I have to tell you that in a large operation like that, it takes skill and energy and continuity to sew sacks for a large thrashing machine. Let me tell you about a thrashing machine. I realize that not too many people in the listening audience know exactly what a thrashing machine is. Yet in the early part of my life and in the years behind that, most of the wheat grain harvesting operations here in the Big Bend, here in the Palouse, down all over and in western and eastern Montana, where I was born and raised, was done by thrashing machines. And envision, for example, a field of wheat and bundles of wheat put into shocks and drying out and getting set to be thrashed. Thrashing machine comes in, and in this case, it was a 15-wagon thrashing machine. That's the measurement of the machine. It would serve 15 wagons in the field. On every wagon would be a team of horses and a man. There'd be 10 spike pitchers in the field throwing bundles onto the wagon. And the wagons would come in 2 at a time, pitching the bundles onto the endless belt with the cleats into what you call the cylinder, which is the entry of the large thrashing machine. And I can tell you this was one of the largest. The wagons come in, and there'll be 2 or 3 men pitching the bundles in, and they'll approach the cylinder, the input of the thrashing machine, too wide and too high. It's extremely vulnerable. The thrashing machine can handle it as long as the men put the bundles on properly. And if they don't, it might clog it up, it might stop the machine. Well, being an FBI agent posing as a sack sewer and a farmer, and he had made me kind of the assistant separator man because of what I obviously knew about thrashing machines, I had to fill the bill and shouting instructions and so forth. I felt that I was learning how the operation was happening. I felt that I was learning how he was possibly skimming wheat. I might tell you that there are many ways to skim wheat. One of the ways is the way I'm going to tell you about in this case. In other cases, there might be a diversion of the grain into a side tank that the farmer customer doesn't know anything about. It might be emptied once or twice a day. This machine used another approach that I will tell you about later. I might tell you more about this machine. It was the old-fashioned, would handle 15 wagons, which is the largest. Imagine 15 wagons in the field, and throwing the straw into the famous straw stack that used to cover the Palouse and all the country west of town. You don't see any straw stacks anymore, and operated by a straw-fueled, not a tractor, but a fire tractor, a steam engine, literally a steam engine, if you can imagine it, that was fed by a team of horses and another wagon that went back and forth, constantly shoving straw, weeds, and everything else to make the fire. A big belt reaching back to the large thrashing machine, and of course that was what you call the steam engine, which would have the significant whistle every time during the noon hour, at the end of the noon hour, at the end of the day, and so forth. A very picturesque thing, but very touchy. So here we had the operation, and Agent Dellwo trying to figure out how they were skimming. Well, I finally figured out the possibility of how they were skimming. I would sew the sacks, haunch them onto the truck, and the truck would eventually be loaded. Then it would leave and go a half a mile to the west of the section line and turn south. And then another truck would be wheeled in to take over. but occasionally there would be a lapse of time. Both trucks would be gone, so they had a standby truck back about 100 yards. And if neither truck had gotten back in time, they would run the standby truck forward and into place. And I'd load sacks onto that until the right truck came forward. The second evening I was there, I discovered that the standby truck was filled at the end of the day, and it went up to the section line a half-mile to the west. It didn't turn south as the other trucks turned. It turned north, which indicated to me that it had another place to go to empty its load. It turned out that that was true, which I'll tell you about a little later. Let me tell you about the relationship between me, the sack sewer, who, because I was in a sensitive spot, and all the men that were unloading bundles onto the conveyor that went into the cylinder. I might tell you that there's a kind of a built-up antagonism between them and the sack sewer, because the sack sewer is shouting directions, and sometimes they shout a little too loud. And also, in my case, I was a stranger that had replaced for several days the so-called Indian chief that was supposed to be the sack sewer. So I could tell that when I shouted directions to them with my voice that I kind of developed in Gonzaga, going through there wasn't the typical farm boy voice, that it created a little static. One time, as I'm nearing I'm nearing the termination of my visit there. One time, they were unloading, and it seemed like they were almost deliberately piling the bundles wrong and causing the cylinder, which is the input, which the concaves and so forth, which is the input of the thrashing machine, to clog up, which of course is devastating. And I shouted to the man to slow down, and he didn't slow down. And I finally shouted the words, "Slow down, you asshole," which he apparently heard. And within about 5 minutes, he was standing next to me. He said, "I will see you behind the straw stack at the end of the day." I knew what that threat was. And that was that he was going to whip me and get some kind of a revenge. At the end of the day, I walked around, and I might tell you that I was on the Gonzaga boxing team, I was on the Charlotte, Montana boxing team, and I could box fairly well. I was a fairly good boxer, had received some special training in the FBI. Nevertheless, I was somewhat apprehensive as I walked behind the straw stack to meet him at the end of the day. It was one of the most significant experiences of my life, and I might say that unfortunately I haven't had to go through this more than 2 or 3 times. I walked back there. There he was, and there were 2 men standing next to him, and I might tell you that the word had spread all through this crew of 30 men, and at the end of the day, silence, all watching. And I walked behind there and walked up to him. And I might tell you that in the field of boxing, and I know some of the listeners understand boxing, that it's fundamental that you know how to throw a punch, that it's very seldom that the farm worker, that the guy out in the field knows how to throw a punch. Almost always, as they come at you in a fight, they throw the right hand with the right foot forward, which is not the way to throw a punch. And that's what I anticipated. As I walked up to him, he, expecting to catch me with a fast haymaker, he walked forward and threw a punch. And of course, any of you boxers know what counterpunch to that is. It's head down, left fist up, right fist into his face as his fist goes over your shoulder, left hand to his ear, right hand into his solar plexus. And that's exactly what I did. And the young man was on the, was knocked to the ground, his nose was bleeding, and his wind was knocked out, only because I'd had so much experience under Frankie Holland and Jimmy Woods, the coaches over at Gonzaga on their boxing team, and then some special training and so forth. I knew that that was probably the end of my stay there. The boss came out to me and he said, well, my pseudonym was Jim. He said, well, Jim, I think as you know, this is your last day here. I would suggest that you get ready to leave, and here's your check. He said, I wouldn't guarantee what's going to happen. I was sleeping outside, by the way, with my bedroll. I wouldn't guarantee what's going to happen to you later on in the night as a result of this fight that you just successfully finished. But you might not be able to successfully finish the next one. So I prepared to leave. My bedroll was there. I was leaving it. I walked to the end of the farmyard, or the end of the area behind the machine, and I was watching. And at about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I could see them come over and come up to my bedroll, and which I had fixed up as if I was lying there, and they nudged it and kicked it, and then they finally said, the son of a bitch is gone. At that point, which is a full moonlight night, I started to jog across the field to get away. And a couple of them jogged in behind me, but I was an excellent runner, had been a runner in high school and so forth, had no trouble keeping ahead of them. I ran and jogged 2 or 3 miles back to the friendly farmer where my car was parked, got in my car, and to drive back by the thrashing outfit and to eventually drive back to Denver. I drove by, and I drove to the section line that I'm talking about, and I turned north instead of south. And I drove about 5 miles to a warehouse warehouse elevator, and there was the truck parked that I'm talking about to be unloaded in the morning. This is how he was skimming. And I might tell you that in my report back, they told me that they were expanding the case and that another agent had audited that particular elevator warehouse and found that this operator had over 10,000 bushels of grain there. In other words, I might tell you some more of the operation of an outfit like this. They would start a large threshing outfit of this kind would start as this man did in Oklahoma in the early part of the summer when the grain in that area was becoming ripe. And he would thrash there, then he'd thrash on up to the north until finally he would end the season up in North Dakota or Minnesota, thrashing the entire distance. And the crew would accumulate and deaccumulate and gather, farmers helping each other as they would go. And of course, being a guy that was skimming, he was probably skimming all the way. And it was assumed that they were, and different farmers had different ways of counteracting that. I went back to Denver and went back to my SINRAD case, SINRAD. And I might tell you that that was a highly interesting case, somewhat surprising that Agent Dellwo from Montana be working on a case of that kind at age 24, but that was because of some experiences I had as a young man in Montana, that I'd learned electronics, things of that kind, and was operating this, what you call the technical surveillances that we had at that time, that many years ago, at Los Alamos, having to do with the atomic bomb. I might tell you that I also participated in law enforcement training schools, and I also became a speaker for the FBI. And I might tell you that many times I told the story of the thrashing machine case that I participated in the panhandle of Oklahoma. Now I want to tell you how the FBI, I might say, discovered that I had some abilities or some knowledge that was relevant to cases they had on Indian reservations. It's surprising to me even now that this was an oversight of the FBI. They were so taken up with gang warfare in New York and Chicago and Denver and so forth. They had no agents in the FBI of any real background or history on Indian reservations or in the farm country to handle this type of case. Some months before I went to Denver, I was sitting as a young agent in Boulder City, Nevada. I was on a surveillance coverage of Hoover Dam, in which we had a fear and a report that a German sabotage system had a plan of sabotaging Hoover Dam. And that's why I and several other agents were on a surveillance of Hoover Dam and of some of our informants that were involved in this German espionage sabotage effort. I received a telephone call from the agent in charge of the Salt Lake City Field Division, out of which I worked. He said, "Bob Dellwo," he said, "we have a need of an agent on the Walker River Reservation." He said, when the sheriff called, wanted an agent to head up a posse onto the Walker River Reservation to try to catch a fugitive that's on the run. He said the sheriff from, when he called me, he said, "This agent better be able to ride a horse." And I remember answering Jay Newman of the Salt Lake City Field Division that, well, as you know, Jay, I've never been in a posse before, but they can't find a horse in Nevada that I can't ride. And I meant that because I'd had a lot of horse experience in my farm work in Montana. The next step was, he said, "Well, Bob," he said, "you go out to the airport out of Boulder City." Some hours later, I was landing in a wheat field near a barn complex just off the Walker River Reservation. The plane landed and I piled out and jogged toward a corral where I saw a number of men on horseback waiting. You can see the psychology. Here was this young agent trotting in, and the phone call having been sent, "We need an agent of the FBI to head up this posse because we're probably going into the Walker River Reservation." I jogged in, and there was a horse standing there, and it was probably the friskiest horse they could find. I walked up to it and did what horsemen do to get on the horse, checking the cinches and buckles and everything and around, talking to the horse, rolled into the saddle, and the horse bolted. Then I talked to it, and I heard somebody say, "You can see that he has ridden a horse before." And I remember turning to him, I said, "What else is new?" The posse began, and here I was in the lead, mostly because this was the fastest horse of the bunch, and I had trouble holding the horse back. One by one, the men in the posse would come up and talk to me, and they would discover that I was from the Flathead and that I knew horses and so forth. And the fugitive was some distance up ahead of us, apparently riding horseback. We arrived at the Walker River Reservation, and there in the entrance was a tribal representative and a law enforcement officer waiting. And as we went in, they said, "Okay, now who are you? Are you the agent of the FBI?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What's your name?" I said, "Bob Dellwo." "Dellwo?" He said, do you have a dad that lives up on the Flathead Reservation?" I said, "That's where I was born and raised." He said, "Was your dad's name Dennis?" I said, "You knew my dad?" He said, "Yes, I knew your dad real well. I worked for years up on the Flathead Indian Reservation." The posse continued, and finally, far up ahead, we saw our man on a horse coming up into a canyon, which over the hill would go into the lake on the Walker River Reservation. And as before, I was in the lead because I couldn't hold my horse back very well. It was the fastest horse of the bunch. And I'm sure that that horse saw the man try to escape, running up the ridge toward the top of the ridge, hoping to get over it. And to me, it was the man. He was the fugitive. But to the horse, it is probably a critter that he was used to chasing after. And as we came, the horse ran up the hill, ran around the man, chased him down the hill with the man yelling, "Get that horse off me, get that horse away." And finally I was standing there, the horse between me and the man, ordering him to lie on his back and be prepared for an arrest. And at the end of the story, we are on our way back, and they said, "Well, we appreciate that." One of the men in the posse said, "We appreciate that the FBI had somebody like you to help us in this posse on the Walker River Reservation. Thank you very much."
Thank you, Bob and Ellen. That was excellent. Thank you very much for listening to us, and I hope to have you here again.